Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm kind of on a roll right now of making videos today. So.
Maritime history is full of
would you shut your face? Apologies. Mr. B, we talked about this. I saved your life when you were a SEAL. There's no reason for you to just start talking over me. It's rude. Okay. Chilly. My nose itches. Alright. Oh. I'm kicking my own ass right now. Okay. What was I going to say? I don't remember. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. I want to thank YouTube yesterday. We had the strongman competition, and I came in 114th place out of 73 million. And we just basically had a little competition. It was with the NFL again, and it was the 225-pound bench press. And it was good. I mean, you know, I got up there and they're like, "It's 225, man, let's do it." And I just took a lot of those weights off and just lifted the bar. So, you know, I cracked out that bar a few dozen times and called it a day. So it's pretty good. But anyways, you need to like and subscribe to the channel. YouTube's given me possession of my own Hitman squad. And, you know, if you're watching the video, I'm going to have you offed. If that's what the term that the kids say nowadays. Don't mind me. I'm still snacking on jujubes, the little candies. Because they're good. Yep. You know, like, subscribe, all that stuff. I'm just going to snack because these are delicious. But we're going to go with the Uninhabited Island with the dark history, the missing crew of the Sarah Joe. So, this is Mrballen. Look at him. I'm going to get his shirt and leave the top button open too. I'm going to get his shirt and only do the top button. How about that? Why am I getting mad at Mrballen? He didn't do anything. Okay, we're going to go ahead and start the video. Like, subscribe, all that garbage. Let's go.
Tales of sea monsters and, you know, mariners going out and returning in different parts of the world and not knowing how they got there. You've abandoned ships. You have all these crazy things that happen out on the ocean. And many of them are just stories. We like to believe them because they're fascinating, but few of them actually hold up and are true. But one story, it is absolutely as fascinating as some of these very tall tales, but also happens to be true. Today, I'm going to cover that story, and it is the story of the lost Hawaiian fisherman. So the too long didn't read version of this story is you have 5 highly experienced Hawaiian fishermen that take off on a daytime fishing trip. The weather turns really bad while they're out in the water and they don't return. Despite an extensive search effort, they are not located, and after a year, the families and friends of the lost fishermen, they host a memorial service and assume that their loved ones are gone forever. 9 years later, they make a discovery on a very small island 2,300 miles away that calls into question the entire story. It's an amazing story, it's a tragic story, but it's one worth listening to right to the very end. Before we get started, if you are into strange and mysterious stories like the one I've just described, my channel is going to be a bevy of content just like that. And so if you could gently liquidate... if you could gently liquidate... I can't even say it. If you could gently liquidate the like button... If you could gently liquidate the like button and subscribe and turn on all notifications, that would be great. Scott Moorman was born in 1952 in the San Fernando Valley in California. At a young age, he loved the show Adventures in Paradise, which was about this crew of young sailors that would travel the South Pacific looking for adventure and passengers to pick up along the way. And it was just this brilliant show to him, and he became obsessed with living in the South Pacific when he got older. Specifically, he wanted to live in Hawaii. But that wouldn't necessarily happen right away, because at a young age, he got married and had a son and stayed in California. But in 1975, he and his wife split up. And so he took that as an opportunity to go fulfill that childhood dream of living in Hawaii. And so he, on his own, his son stayed with his former wife. He, Scott, moves out to the east coast of Maui on Hawaii. And he moves into this little town called Nahiku. Now, Nahiku was full of lots of native Hawaiians and a growing population of kind of like refugees in a way, Vietnam veterans kind of that were over living in the mainland. You have hippies and kind of earth-loving people that do a lot more partying than working. They were all kind of congregating in this same town. And Scott, he loved that culture and he quickly became a part of it. But he also, unlike a lot of the kind of hippies that made their way to Nahiku, that were part of that growing population, Scott really wanted to kind of become a part of the whole culture of Nahiku, because he growing up, he loved Hawaii. He didn't want to be the others on the island. He wanted to be a part of the main culture. And so he took it upon himself to learn the sort of pidgin English that locals would use. He took time to learn some of the cultural traditions that they had, and really went out of his way to try to befriend some of the locals. And while he wasn't really embraced as, a kind of local, he did form a number of friendships with local Hawaiians, and in time he really felt like this is where he belongs. This was home to him 100%. So he would only go back to California one time. He goes back once for his son's birthday, and he also sees his parents while he's there, and they are all pleading with him to come back, be with your family. They want him to stay. And he says, no, Nahiku is where I belong, and I can't envision myself living anywhere else. And so when he flies back after that one visit to California for his son's birthday, when he flies back to Nahiku, that would be the last time that his son, his former wife, and his parents, his family back in the mainland would see him. That's the last they would see him. On February 11th, 1979, Scott and four of his friends decide that they're not going to go to work that day. They all worked construction together. Instead, they're going to go fishing because they all love to fish and the weather was beautiful, so they said, why not? Now, none of them owned their own boat, so they had to ask a friend who had a 17-foot Boston whaler named the Sarah Joe. Their friend allowed them to use it, and so they got their boat, they went to the store, got some beer, snacks, and got some ice for their big ice chest so they could pack it with the fish they caught, that they hopefully caught, and they were on their way. The part of Hawaii that Scott and his friends lived in, the east coast of Maui, at the time did not get any TV stations, and radio broadcasts were done maybe once a week and were hard to pick up. So people in that area, especially fishermen, anybody that was out on the water, they were accustomed to going out without a weather report. They basically played the weather by their eye. They kind of just sized it up and said, does it seem okay? Okay, it seems good, and they would go out. Obviously that's pretty risky, but the locals were pretty good at it, and Scott and his buddies also were very good at this point at kind of reading the weather, and so they thought this day was going to be just fine. Now, in order to get to the place where they intended to fish, they would need to pass through something called the Alanui Haha Channel, which is considered to be one of the roughest and most dangerous areas for all sailors anywhere near Hawaii. So it's a dangerous place. It's at certain points, it is almost 7,000 feet deep.
Damn.
Very strong surface currents. It's just a risky place to be if, for example, there was a big storm. Now, when Scott and the Sarah Joe crew took off, the water was calm, the weather was beautiful, and by about 10 a.m., when they believed they must have been in the channel at this point, the weather was still very calm. However, a low pressure system had picked up very suddenly between 10 and noon, and so when they probably were somewhere towards the end of the channel when they were going to be making their way into open water to fish, there was beginning to be torrential downpour all along the channel, and it eventually turned into a full-scale hurricane. So on the island, people described this particular storm as being one of the worst they've seen in 50 plus years. This is like a sudden, freak, horrible storm. Of the boats that took off to go fishing out of this east coast section of Maui, there was 4 fishing boats that went out. 3 returned. The one that didn't was, of course, the Sarah Joe. At 5 p.m., the Coast Guard is notified by their friends and family that they have not returned yet. The storm is still raging, gale force winds, torrential downpour, but they still send out a plane to look overhead. A number of crews were sent out to go look for them, even with the incredible risk of searching in this weather. But considering the dangers they were in, they decided it was necessary. The searchers who were in the boats, the boat crews that were sent out to look for the Sarah Joe crew, they said that at best they could see maybe 50 feet in front of them, and even that was a stretch. So it was a limited search, but they did go out on the day of the storm. Over the next 5 days, the Coast Guard led a search that included 44 planes and boats covering a 56,000 square mile search block for the Sarah Joe, but nothing was found. There was absolutely no trace of them, and so after 5 days, unfortunately, the Coast Guard called off the search. However, the people in their hometown in Nahiku, they knew these 5 men. These were incredibly capable, very experienced fishermen. They were all great swimmers. They believed that because they hadn't found a trace of them, that perhaps they were still alive out there. And so they, as a community, raised $50,000 to pay private ships and planes to continue the search. So there was an extended search that went on for a couple more weeks that covered an even bigger swath of territory, but at the end still yielded no results. The people that were doing the searching were just baffled, because when people go missing at sea, there's some indication a lot of times when they're just fishing basically right off the coast, there's some indication of what happened to them. It's rare that you would have 0% found. Absolutely no idea what happened to these 5 fishermen. 1 year after their disappearance, the families and friends decide to host a memorial and mourn the loss officially for their loved ones. It was believed at this point that they had all perished. 2,300 miles southwest of the Hawaiian Islands lies this tiny little stretch of, I guess you can call them islands, called the Taongi Atoll. And these little tiny strips of land that were barely higher than sea level barely sustained any life. There was a couple scrub plants that took hold here and there, but there's no fresh water. The only recorded human life that's ever been there was during World War II. A number of Japanese soldiers were stranded there briefly, but it is 200 miles from the nearest inhabited land. It's very far from any major shipping lane. It's just a place that, as a human being, you don't want to go. In fact, it was actually considered, when they were testing the atomic bomb, when the United States was, it was considered to be a great spot to test the atomic bomb because no one's there and no one's anywhere near it. So incredibly isolated. On September 10th, 1988, marine biologist John Naughton, along with 4 other crew members, descended upon the Taongi Atoll. They were sent there by the Marshall Islands to find a suitable wildlife sanctuary for some sea turtles and seabirds. Within 30 minutes of arriving at the atoll, John and his crew saw what looked like a skeleton of a boat, a Boston whaler boat that was down on the shore. John was actually a resident of Maui, so he's from Hawaii, and he saw on the back of this kind of skeletal remains of this boat the letters HA, which means it's registered in Hawaii. And so he's intrigued because we're 2,300 miles from Hawaii, and he starts moving the sand away to get a better look to see if there's any more writing on the boat. And he makes out a couple of letters, an S, an R, an H, an O, an E, and he puts it together. He's like, this is the Sarah Joe. This is the boat that went missing 9 years earlier. And the reason he knew it that quickly is because he was one of the people deeply involved in the search efforts to find these lost fishermen. He was like leading search groups. He was totally committed to finding them. And here he...
Wow, can you imagine that? You're involved in the search and just, you don't find anything, and then just by chance you stumble across it. I mean, it's the boat, it's not the crew, but still it's got to give you a little bit of closure that it didn't go under, they didn't drown or something like that. I mean, they still could have, but
he is in a crazy twist of fate. 2,300 miles away, almost a decade later, finding the boat. Now, the boat did not initially provide any sort of information about where the fishermen might be. There was nothing on it. It was just the wood, very degraded from water, wear and tear. But the crew decided that they would search the island and just kind of look around, because perhaps the crew, even if it was years and years ago, maybe they landed here and then they ultimately perished once they were here. So maybe we can find their remains or just some sign that they might have been here. John walks about 100 yards away from the Sarah Joe, and he sees what looks like kind of a crudely constructed cross out of driftwood. And below it, he can see that there's a bunch of rocks that have been placed definitely in some sort of decorative way, and it looks like a gravesite. And considering what they're looking for, he thinks there's the first of the bodies that we're going to find. He calls over his crew, and so they begin kind of moving some things aside. They don't want to totally disturb the grave, just to be respectful. But a little ways down, the inside of the grave is not only bones, but they find this little book. The book had no writing in it, and it's hard to even call it a book. It was more like a stack of papers. But on each page, there was a little square cutout of tinfoil that sat on the page. Basically, every page had a little square of tinfoil and nothing else to it. No one knew what it meant, but undoubtedly, somebody had very clearly buried somebody else right here in a very shallow grave, and had left this little book in here with whoever was buried here. And so while John and a couple of his crew are looking at this book and trying to make sense of it, one of his crew members that was just kind of standing back looking at the site commented that, the bones that are in that grave, they're not very bleached. Now, if a bone's been sitting for a long time, it will basically bleach and become totally white. Everything comes off the bone. These bones looked relatively fresh. So whoever was buried here, they had been buried recently. At this point, John and his crew have basically abandoned their kind of wildlife sanctuary research, and now they're just scouring this little scrub of land in the Taongi Atoll for any other signs of things that could have to do with the Sarah Joe crew, and they found nothing else. So they report back to the Coast Guard and alert the Marshallese authorities that what was found on the island, and they send out a couple of forensic experts to examine the bone. They were able to determine that the bones in the grave belonged to Scott Moorman. When news got back to the Hawaiian mainland that Scott Moorman had been found,
at least it's considerate that they buried him instead of, like, if he had died on the boat, that they didn't give him the burial at sea. Burying him there, even if it's a somewhat shallow grave, I would much rather have that than the burial at sea, because ultimately, if it's found like this, your family has something, and they can give you a proper burial instead of the empty coffin kind of thing. I think that means more. Well, it does to me, at least.
The family members of the other 4 fishermen that went missing on the Sarah Joe, they hired private detectives to go scour the Taongi Atoll, look everywhere, see if you can find our loved ones' remains. And so this team of private detectives and a dive team and all these people are sent to the Taongi Atoll, and they look everywhere. They're digging up the sand. They have dive teams going out into the water. I mean, they are really leaving no stone unturned. And all they're able to find is the outboard motor of the Sarah Joe, which was a little ways off the coast from where the boat itself was found, wedged in some coral. And then they also found a handful of more bones on the beach near where that shallow grave where Scott Moorman was buried. But those bones also belong to Scott Moorman. So there was nothing else found of the other 4 fishermen or any indication of what happened to the boat. There's nothing. And in fact, researchers that were able to look at the bones of Scott Moorman, there wasn't enough evidence there to help them determine a cause of death. So we don't even know how he passed away or when he passed away. However, it was determined just based on the bleaching of the bones that it was a relatively recent death. I don't know what the timeline is on that, but recent is the term that's used. While it was a very big deal that
I would say dehydration or starvation.
they located Scott Mormon's remains on the Taongi Atoll, even though it was 10 years later. This is revelatory. This is a really big deal, not only for the families of the fishermen, but for anybody involved. This is a really big deal. But there was an additional revelation once Scott Mormon's bones were found that basically turned this case upside down. There's already a bunch of questions like, who buried Scott Mormon? How did Scott Mormon become freshly buried almost a decade later? You know, how long had they been there? There's some basic questions that you're going to ask, but there's one fact that nobody seems to be able to reconcile, and that was 6 years after they went missing, the Marshall Islands conducted a government survey of the Taongi Atoll, which would mean they scoured the islands, all those little strips of land that make up the Taongi Atoll. They scoured it, just taking measurements and basically mapping out the Taongi Atoll. I think it was in preparation for potentially turning it into this wildlife sanctuary. So they looked everywhere on the Taongi Atoll 6 years after the Sarah Joe went missing. So they go missing. 6 years later, there's this government survey of the Taongi Atoll. And guess what? They ended up looking at that survey, and there's no boat, there's no shallow grave, there's nothing. It's just an uninhabited strip of land, nothing else. There's no boats there. Experts, when this was revealed, said that, well, had they, the Sarah Joe, the crew of the Sarah Joe, gone dead in the water following the storm, they could have drifted the 2,300 miles to the Taongi Atoll in roughly 3 months. But they weren't there at the 6-year mark.
Yeah.
So what were they doing between the disappearance and the 6-year mark, which would have been the earliest they could have arrived, because prior to, they would have been discovered during this audit. So you have a 6-year gap where no one can account for where they were. Even if they made it to the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day after they had disappeared, that they had been somehow surviving in the open ocean for 6 years, and they just so happened to land at the Taongi Atoll 6 years and a day later. Basically, just after the survey's done. Let's say they make it there. Who buried Scott Mormon? And what was the booklet that was buried with him with the tinfoil squares? This is a totally uninhabited stretch of land. There is no one there to perform any sort of burial ritual. Even if we're willing to say that maybe one of the other fishermen buried Scott Mormon, well, then where are the other fishermen? Some people wonder, are they still alive? So like many of my videos, unfortunately, there isn't really a good conclusion here. It just kind of ends in a bunch of questions. But I would love it if you included in the comments section what you think could be the reason behind that 6-year gap.
So they scanned the island. So the guys go missing. 6 years after they went missing, they scanned the island, and they did not see anything. Of course, they weren't looking for anything, but apparently it sounds like that was pretty obvious. And then the body was found 9 years total, so 3 years after, and he had died recently. And who buried him? It's crazy. Yeah. Who buried him? Was he the last? I mean, he couldn't have been the last survivor. And I'm trying to think like what the water. If let's say they got to that island and then they sailed off, and they hit a jet stream, would it bring them back around, so they'd circle back around and be stuck at that island? So they just kept, no matter where they went, they were doomed to always come back to that area. Not necessarily that island, but that area. Is there any other of the, I don't know. This is giving me a headache thinking about it. Well, I'm going to end it here. Like and subscribe to the video if you like me or you don't like me. You like the video or you don't like me, you just do it anyways, just because I'm saying it and YouTube's telling you to do it. I just want to thank all the people who watch the videos. It's ridiculous. I don't know why you do that. I don't know why you subscribe. And the people overseas, like I said before, the analytics they give me, Croatia and Sweden and UK and Ireland. I don't know how I'm supposed to say it. It's just kind of crazy. Anybody ever done one of those DNA tests? You find out where you are. I did one, and I'm like, it was just St. Patrick's Day, so it's a little humorous story. My mom was born on the military base in Munich in '47. And then she moved to Wales. She was like 2. She lived there until she was 16. Then she moved to America. She hated the Irish. Would never let me wear green on, I almost said Valentine's Day, on St. Patrick's Day. Would not allow me to wear green. She died, and a few years later I did tests through 23andMe and found out that I'm like 60% British and Irish. And I just imagine how mad she would be. Nope, you're just British, 0% Irish. And if anyone's done it, I found out I'm related to the Cheddar Man, that frozen guy or whatever from England. I'm also related to King Louis XVI. I share a bloodline with him. So I'm going over there soon to reclaim the crown. A lot of things are going to be changing when I'm over there. I just got to get the passport and the money, and then I go over there and I get the crown and the chicks, or deported. Can you claim the crown if you're not a citizen? Get back to me on that. All right, leave a comment in the thing and just say something, and then I'll respond to it, because that's what I try to do. I'm going to end it here. Have a good day. Have a good night. Whatever it is, just make sure it's one of them.